ballot questions put before the voters in only 10 years. So if you can imagine 12 referenda in 10 years. So I was literally either planning one, doing one, or recovering from one. Fortunately, 10 out of the 12 passed, although I probably learned more from the two that did not. After leaving the superintendency, I was a consultant for school districts with Springstead and then Baker Tilly. And now I'm working on my own with school election strategies and partnering with Morris and Leatherman. So that a little bit in terms of my background, as you can kind of figure out who you're listening to and what my perspective is. All right, there we go. Begin thinking about planning for getting out the vote. It's a good idea early in the process as compared to later to review some laws, policies, and make sure that you have the background you need to make important decisions later. So seeking legal counsel in some areas, two that are mentioned on that first bullet are auto dialers. Those are the systems that many school districts have to automatically contact parents. Can you use those or can you not for getting out the vote? Robocalls are calls that are made where your phone rings and when you pick it up, you hear a recorded call. There are also laws related to how and when they can be used. There also are some key policies for the district. I mentioned a few in the second bullet. Data privacy. Email oftentimes can be a problem if you have opposition and they ask to see emails. Some school districts choose to have the superintendent and key administrative staff use private email when they're communicating with a vote yes committee, for example, and that potentially can insulate those emails from public disclosure. Oftentimes we hear about what can we put in employees' mailboxes as another example. In the third bullet, how you spend public funds is one of the biggest things to be careful with. Barbara Nickel, who co-authored my third book on referendum planning, oftentimes uses the phrase that superintendents and school boards can help the vote yes committee and they can work with the vote yes committee, but it has to be on their dime, on their time. Meaning that if public funds are being used, you've crossed the line. One example of a way to insulate yourself from that challenge is if the superintendent or key administrative staff are, meeting with the vote yes committee, better to do it, after 5 p.m. Or on a Saturday, rather than during the day. Another question that comes up oftentimes about buildings and grounds is, can the vote yes committee have a table, at the home football games, for example, handing out literature? So those are the kinds of things that you want to look at your local policies, talk to your lawyer, and make sure that you know exactly how you're going to handle all of that before those questions come up. So how important is GOTV? I'll mention later in the presentation that, unfortunately, while GOTV is one of the three most important parts of a successful campaign, it often is one of the weakest parts of a campaign. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One being it's by definition late in the campaign. So everybody's been working really hard for months and months, and now you got this last thing to do, and it can feel that like you might be running out of energy. The other reason that often it's not executed very well is people just don't know the research behind it in terms of what works and what doesn't work. Paul Wellstone, who was Minnesota Senator, was famously effective with getting out the vote. On his last campaign, if you wanted to work on the Wellstone campaign, you had to sign an agreement that you were going to volunteer 1 day a week. You were going to write a check out to the campaign, and you had to take a vacation day on election day to help with GOTV. And on his last GOTV effort, he had 5,000 people pounding on doors all day long to get out that vote. So Wellstone said it was pretty important if you had to do those three things. The next few slides give you a graphic look at an unsuccessful get out the vote effort. So what you're seeing in this particular slide is a school district that did a scientific random sample survey to test support for the referendum. And on the left-hand side for parents, you're seeing that in the survey, they had just short of 68% support for the tax increase associated with that referendum. Very, very strong support. Not surprisingly, non-parent support was much, much lower. In the blue-colored bar, you're seeing what percentage of each group voted on election day. And as you can see on the left, the parent turnout was miserable and barely higher than the non-parent turnout. And obviously that is a profile of an unsuccessful getting out the vote campaign. Here you're seeing the same comparisons based on age. We typically see the highest levels of support from the youngest voters. So that 18 to 44 on the left is the age of the voters. And again, going back to that scientific random sample survey, 70.8% of the youngest voters supported the tax increase. But if you look at the bar next to that, only 11.3% of them showed up and cast a vote. And you can see the same comparisons for kind of that mid-range and that older voter. Looking at the older voters, as you can see, their turnout was more than 3 times higher than the 18 to 44-year-olds. So those were yes votes that never got in the door and ballots that never got in the ballot box. This slide is emphasizing whether the campaign committee made any contact with voters as part of the GOTV effort. So over on the left side, where you see no contact made, what it's showing is for the people that they did not contact, they only had 34.2% turnout, and almost 2/3 did not turn out. During the canvassing part of the campaign, they went through a process to identify yes voters. People who were identified as yes voters and were contacted had a turnout of almost 61%. But if you look over at the arrow on the right, for people who were assumed to be a yes voter, but were not contacted by the campaign, there was only a 39.6% turnout. So part of a successful get out the vote effort is not only identifying yes votes, but also contacting them. because contacting them, preferably multiple times, has a significant benefit in terms of increasing turnout. So when we talk about executing successful GOTV, option one in this Wizard of Id cartoon is to cheat. So when people come and ask when to vote, if they look like a no voter, you tell them the vote is on November 4. If they look like a yes vote, you tell them it's November, or excuse me, I have that opposite. If it's a no vote, you tell them to vote on November 5. The yes votes, you tell them November 4. Assuming you can't get away with cheating, some people try other options, like having the dogs help get out the vote. That's another way that you could cheat. If you're not going to cheat, then you have to develop a plan that uses research and best practices. The material that I will go through, a lot of it focuses on two researchers by the name of Gerber and Green. I'll talk about them a little bit later. But here are the key components of a successful get out the vote. Step one is to figure out how many folks are going to vote. This is a combination of research and art. The research part looks back in time, and if you're planning to do a referendum in November of 2022, for example, you can look back in the Secretary of State's data and find out, well, how many people voted in November of 2020? How many people voted in November of 2018? The apples to apples comparison would be the 2018 vote, even year, non-presidential. If you're looking at a vote in 2023 and you're going to be the only thing on the ballot, the typical turnout is 15 to 25%. But again, you can look back in your history to see how many people voted in 2011 or 13 or 15 or 17 in odd years when the only thing on the ballot was the school district. The same is true, of course, for national elections. If you're looking at November of 2024, in Minnesota, the typical turnout is close to 80%. But you can also look back specifically in your school district to see how many people voted in 2020, how many people voted in 2016. So figure out how many people are going to vote and make an educated estimate of that. Figure out how many yes voters you need to win. Well, that's pretty easy math. If your first step was estimating 10,000 voters, you need 5,001 to win. Step three in the campaign is to canvass. Canvass is what I call one of the big three: canvassing, communications, and get out the vote. Canvassing is typically done in the 3 or 4 months leading up to Election Day. And with canvassing, you're texting people, you're emailing people, you're designing a website and driving people to your website, you're knocking on doors, you're using Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. So the canvassing process is you're looking at the registered voters who live within the boundaries of your school district, and you're looking for yes votes. And so if you talk to somebody at the door and they tell you to jump off a cliff and there's no way they're going to vote for a tax increase, you mark them as a no voter. And so canvassing essentially sorts voters between those who are yes and no or undecided. And that 130% relates to a recommendation in terms of providing the campaign with margin. So going back to that second step in the process, if you need 5,000 votes, 5,001 to win, multiply 5,000 times 1.3, and that would be your canvassing target. And by a target, I mean we're looking for that many yes votes. How many you really think you need times that 1.3. Planning and executing GOTV strategies that work to mobilize yes voters that have been identified by the campaign. And demobilize likely no voters into non-voters. One social psychological way to think about that is to try to create cognitive dissonance. An example of cognitive dissonance could be, let's say that you run a reading with grandparents program in your elementary or your primary elementary schools. So every Wednesday, retired men come in and for half an hour read to kids. Well, the more people that you get under the roof interacting with kids, the more you create this cognitive dissonance. And what I mean by that is their natural inclination as an older man might be to vote no to a tax increase, but they have this ongoing wonderful experience with kids that makes them think twice about voting no. In the best case scenario is that cognitive dissonance turns a no vote into a yes vote, but an acceptable outcome is they just don't vote. And there are lots of examples of how potentially to create cognitive dissonance. I'll mention one more example. In one of my superintendencies, there was a kind of a negative relationship with the Lions and Legion clubs. And at the time, it was all men. And at my stage of my career, they all seemed like crabby old men. And I'm not saying they weren't good people, but they were, in their 50s and 60s and 70s, and not too excited about raising their taxes. At some point, we did some brainstorming to say, what can we do to create some cognitive dissonance to give these men another way of thinking about the school district and another way of thinking about the tax increase that we're asking for. And the idea came up to do Flag Day. At the time, the district did nothing district-wide for Flag Day. And the only thing that happened would be if an individual teacher, chose to do something in her or his classroom on Flag Day. So as we developed the plan, we got the Legion and the Lions Club involved. And eventually on Flag Day, we had dozens of Lions Club and Legion members coming into classrooms, handing out little flags and talking a little bit about the history of the flag. Now, there's no doubt, similar to my comment about grandpa's reading to kids, that when you get people under the roof, interacting with teachers, having good experiences with kids, it's going to build goodwill over time. It's not necessarily a strategy that you can implement in, September of 2022 and affect anybody's vote in November of 2022. So you do need to think of it as kind of a long-term strategy. And then the other thing that's really important is if it's a good idea to do to start, 6 months before a referendum, it better be a good idea to do the next year and the next year and the next year after that, or it will be seen as disingenuous and have the opposite effect, that you're looking for. So we talked a little bit about the process of figuring out how many yes votes you need to win. And this is a little snapshot from New Prague. And it's kind of interesting if you look at it, the third row down, New Prague lost a referendum by a large margin with 2,196 yes votes. But they passed a referendum with 1,569 yes votes. So the year that they got 600 more yes votes, they lost by more than 2,000 votes. And this just shows you the impact of timing when you do your calculations on how many votes you need to win. And if you look at the left column, you'll see some odd years, some even years, some presidential years. And so you really have to pay attention to that timing when you do these estimates that I've been talking about. The art of calculating how many yes votes you need kind of depends on what's going on within the community. If you're in a situation where the city is running a referendum for new parks at the same time that you're trying to get money for technology or an operating referendum, it's going to affect turnout. You're going to have a larger turnout. I recently did surveys for both the school district of Eau Claire and the city of Eau Claire. At the end of the day, they both decided to put ballot proposals in front of the voters this November, both with tax increases. And there's no doubt that the combination of those two is going to make it harder for both to win and also drive turnout up. So sometimes things happen that you're not going to see in the Secretary of State's database of how many people voted in the past because they're unique circumstances. In the case of Eau Claire, they've never had a situation before where both the school district and the city were on the ballot at the same time. And so that's something that's unique, and you need to build that into your model. Another example I can share with you about how the art of predicting can vary the outcome. In Matamidi in 2013, they lost the first operating referendum in the history of the district. And again, I said this was 2013, so it was they're all by themselves. It was a small turnout election. The normal turnout for a school district in a 2013 would be from 20 to 25%. So they made their assumptions based on that turnout range. They identified how many yes votes they needed based on that turnout range of 20 to 25%. And then they lost. Well, when the ballots were counted, they lost because the turnout was over 40%, almost twice as high as quote unquote normal. And in this particular case, an underlying controversy related to open enrollment drove the turnout much, much higher than what they typically would have expected. And so they did not identify enough yes votes to win in that particular case. So again, the science is looking at history. The art is thinking about, is there anything going on right now that might affect that turnout? And organized opposition always is a factor that will drive the turnout up. This is a lawn sign from White Bear Lake during a referendum. And I jokingly told the superintendent, why were they against blue jeans? But I guess it's actually an operating levy that isn't quite spelled right. You can expect 5 to 10% higher turnout if you have organized opposition. The best predictor of organized opposition is whether you've had it in the past. And in our current political climate, the second best predictor is how are the politics of race, gender, COVID playing out in your school district. And the more contentious that is, the more likely your turnout will be somewhat higher than quote unquote normal. So if you think about that GOTV audience, let's say that we decided we need to find 8,000 yes voters to win. And I'm in that number. Remember, we're including that 30% cushion that we talked about. So where do we get information to figure out how we're going to find the number of voters that we need? One option that many school districts use is a scientific random sample survey. In a survey of that kind, not only can you find out what percentage of different demographic groups support the tax increase, but you can also peel the onion back and look at specific groups, specifically age, gender, parent status, how long people have lived in the community, geographically where they live within the community, et cetera. And based on those survey results, you can see what demographic groups show the highest levels of support. We talked previously about canvassing. Canvassing is emailing, driving people to the website, texting, calling, door knocking. And every time you interact with somebody, you're putting them in one of three boxes. They're either a yes vote, a no vote, or an undecided vote. Past voting records, the registered voters within your school district all have voting records. When I work on a project where we do a survey, one of the things we do is we look at every registered voter in the school district and give them a score of 1 to 9. 1 means that person voted in 1 out of the last 9 elections when she or he could have voted. 2 means they voted in 2 out of the last 9, 3 out of the last 9. When you do that data analysis, you can quickly identify which voters do we know are going to show up because they voted in 6 out of the last 9 or more, 6, 7, 8, or 9 out of the last 9. Well, if they're going to show up based on their past voting records, you better talk to them and find out if they're a yes, no, or an undecided voter. You can also use predictive databases. The one that I use most frequently on projects is VAN. That is an acronym for Voter Activation Network. And what a VAN does is looks at every registered voter living within the school district and gives them a score from 1 to 100. And the higher the score, the more likely they're going to vote yes on your referendum. My VAN score is 91. So remember I said that scores are from 1 to 100. The higher the score, the better. I live in downtown St. Paul. So if Joe runs a referendum next year, his campaign better make sure that they talk to me and that I cast a ballot, because with a score of 91, I'm going to be voting yes. Past supporter lists is relevant when a school district is running a referendum, let's say in November of 2022, but they had just run one in 2019 or 2020. And in that earlier election, they had canvassed people and they had a spreadsheet that had 5,000 identified yes votes in it. Now things can change from 2019 to 2022, but if you have a database of 5,000 identified yes voters from a previous election, that's a great place to start when you're looking for your GOTV audience. So now we've gone through the steps. We figured out how many people are going to vote. We figured out how many we're going to identify as our target, remembering the 30% margin. And we've got databases, we've got survey results, we've got VAN. So now that we have the data, then what? Ricker and Ordashuk are researchers who identified a process to develop a core or subordinate message for a campaign. A core message means it's for everybody. So it doesn't matter if it's an older male or a parent or a preschooler, they're going to get the same message. The sub-messages relate to specific demographic groups, and I'll comment more about them in a minute. But this is the formula for developing the message. So I'm just going to walk through each step of that. The P, as you can see, relates to power. So P is the power of each vote. You all heard the expression, every vote counts, every vote is critical. So the P is the power of each vote. The B is the benefit. If this thing passes, what good things happen? What good things happen to kids, to staff, to the community, etc. Over to the right of the plus sign, you see duty. And duty relates to statements like everybody has a responsibility as a citizen to vote. We need to support public education for all of our kids. So it has to do with this, duty as a citizen, duty as a parent to support kids and support public education. And then over on the right, it's the cost. And the cost is how much of my taxes going up. And so when you're building messages, you need everything over on the left, the power, the benefit, and the duty to, in a sense, outweigh what's on the right in terms of the cost to have a successful message. I'll walk through this and show you what that might actually look like. So here we're again focusing on the P. We're expecting a very close election, and your vote is critical.
Both of you seem to have good enough messages for exactly 246 votes. We'll see on Monday who draws the letter Z, and it sounds like there'll probably be a recount as well. But Frank Moe and Christian Wharton, thank you for your time, and I guess good luck.
That little clip was from NPR about Cook County, which is up in the Arrowhead region of Minnesota. They had two people who tied to go on the county board, and they broke their tie with a game of Scrabble, picking letters out of a bag. If you're not familiar with this, in Minnesota law, unless the law stipulates something to the contrary, tie elections are for positions like school boards or county boards are decided by chance. And the two people who tied either are going to be cutting cards or flipping dice, or in this case, playing Scrabble. So when you have a tie vote, it certainly reinforces that every vote matters. My friend and former colleague from Baker Tilly, Kelly Smith, had a bond referendum in New Prague in 2004 that ended up 868 yes and 868 no. And no Scrabble in school referenda. In referenda, if it's a tie, it's a loss. And you know, when you have an outcome like this, you don't need too much reinforcement to understand that every vote does indeed count. Some campaigns push this, I would say, past the envelope into areas that most of us would be uncomfortable with. This is a report card that a campaign delivered in neighborhoods. And the report card is giving people an A, B, C, D, or F for their voting history. You can see at the top, Braddock Massey scored an F and a 55% voting frequency, and all of his neighbors are listed below Braddock. I'm not recommending this. I included the graphic only to emphasize that political campaigns do strongly push the notion that every vote counts and works very hard in that GOTV process to get them in the door. So the power of the vote, that was the P. The B is the benefit. Passage is crucial to the educational future of our kids and our grandkids. We get to the duty. We all have a responsibility as community members to do our part to support our kids. And then we get over to the cost. The investment in our kids and community will cost only pennies a day. So what does that look like when you put this formula together in terms of that final core message? As parents and members of the community, we need to strengthen teaching and learning and make this happen for our kids. Now is the time to invest in our schools and children. The cost is modest, and our kids don't get a second chance. Every vote is vital to our success, and we thank you for your support. So this is an example of a get out the vote message that's based on this formula, and that might be delivered on a website. It might be delivered in a voicemail. It could be delivered in a text, but it's a message that covers all components of the formula. And research would tell us that a well-designed core message like this does improve turnout. Now, I mentioned Green and Gerber earlier. They ran for many years the Yale Civic Engagement Project. They've written multiple books on getting out the vote. And what they do is controlled experiments. And I'll give you one example from Wisconsin in a moment. But what I mean by a controlled experiment is if they had done an experiment in your school district, they might have come in and said, okay, you have 5,000 identified yes voters that you found during your canvassing. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to randomly take half of that group, and they're going to get an email and a reminder call to vote. The other half randomly are going to get an email, a call, and a text. So the only difference between the two, both groups get the email and the call, but half the group randomly got the text. After the election is over, they go to the ballot box, open it up, start counting, and go, oh, that's interesting. The ones that got the text had an 8% higher turnout than those that didn't have the text. So those are the kinds of experiments they do to figure out from a research point of view, what actually works. And I'm going to run through a couple slides, just giving you a sense of what their research says. On the upper left, you see door-to-door context. That's knocking at the door. What the 16 means is that for every 16 doors they knocked on, they got one more person to cast a ballot. Now, at first blush, you might think, gosh, that sounds like a lot of work. You pound on 16 doors, you only get one more vote. But do I have to remind you about my friend Kelly Smith in Belle Plaine, 868 to 868? Sometimes one more vote is all you need to win. And also, if you look at the other graphics on this chart, you're seeing that nothing comes close to that 16. So if you go to the phoning, you get one more vote in the ballot box for each 36 calls. If you drop leaflets at the front door, you get one more vote in the ballot box for each 189 leaflets. And as you can see, email has no detectable effect. And then you're seeing also text messages and social prime. Now, social prime relates to using Facebook, for example. And there are some nuances with social media, one of which people really do pay attention to their friends and being connected to their friends. And their friends inside that social media do have a significant influence on whether they vote or not, more so than just blanket social media. So on this one, what you're seeing, again, starting over with knocking at the door, Green and Gerber call that the gold standard. Knocking on a door face-to-face as the intervention for get out the vote that works the best. And we'll talk about some of these in more detail. So door-to-door is the gold standard. Now, as I go through these next few slides, watch to see how many of them where you see the word authentic bold-faced. In this particular case, with the second bullet, what that's referring to is if I knock at the door and someone opens the door and says, "Hi, Don, I haven't seen you for a while. How you doing?" That's an authentic contact. If they look through the door, have no idea who the person is, it is not authentic. And it's obvious that authentic contacts work better. It also has the potential to influence other voters in the household. So if I knock on the door and I talk to that person for 2 or 3 minutes about the proposal to pass an operating levy and lower elementary class sizes, the person I'm talking to may have a spouse or a parent or an adult child who will then tell those folks in the household that Don stopped and what I talked about and what information I left. So that has some potential to influence people, even those who you do not talk to. Logistics and training are important. One of the kind of grim realities of get out the vote research is that while door-to-door contact is the most effective and much more effective than anything else, it's also hard work. It takes lots of volunteers and takes training. I mentioned Wisconsin as an example, there was a controlled experiment done in Oshkosh and in Stoughton, Wisconsin. And in one case, there were everybody got two mailings, but half of the group, half of the voters also got a knock on the door to get out the vote. And in that particular example, the turnout was 9% higher for the voters who got that knock on the door. Targeted knocks are more effective than blanket. What I mean by that is if you have a database, for example, like that Van database I mentioned, with all the registered voters with a score of 1 to 100. Remember that higher the score, the better. If there's no reason to be knocking on the door for people with Van scores of 50 as compared to people with Van scores of 90. And sometimes, just from a practical point of view, you don't have enough volunteers to knock on everybody's door. In that particular case, you can target your door knocking. Again, using Matamidi as an example, where I was a superintendent for 10 years, one year in a successful referendum for a new building, they knocked on everybody's door in the district that had children from birth through fourth grade or age 4. So birth through age 4. And they got targeted knocks by a volunteer in either a preschool, early childhood, family ed, or kindergarten teacher. And they won that particular election by less than 20 votes. So it's highly likely that targeted door knocking did it in the end. Another thing to think about is while the research talks about door to door, what's most important is face to face. And in the last successful referendum in St. Peter, the superintendent, I think, had something like 150 driveway coffees. So he let people know that on Wednesday from 7 to 8 a.m., he would be at John and Melinda Carlson's at 452 5th Street, and he'll have coffee and donuts. And he stood out on the driveway, and people came and talked to him. So it's that personal contact that's most important. There are GIS mapping systems that support door-to-door work, where you can look at a screenshot of a neighborhood and see who's under the roof for every home and what their characteristics are to help you decide where you're going to knock and where you're not going to knock. And I'll talk a little bit more about that.
Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump and his running mate Mike Pence are holding a campaign event in Eau Claire, Wisconsin tomorrow evening, the same day that Democratic vice presidential candidate Tim Kaine visits Appleton and Madison. Candidate rallies like those are just one way to inspire people to get to the polls and vote. Another technique? A knock on your door. If there's a competitive race for Congress or the legislature where you live, canvassers will probably be on your block in this final full week of campaigning. Candidates, the political parties, and interest groups are in full get-out-the-vote mode. But with early voting already a month old and a tumultuous presidential race affecting voter mood, the exercise has evolved. Reporter Brian Baxt has our story.
On a sunny but crisp recent Saturday afternoon, a couple dozen DFL party volunteers gathered in a former bank building for a tutorial. They were about to fan out in a competitive section of the southern Twin Cities suburbs. Their mission was to work down a carefully honed list of probable Democratic voters, to measure their support for the party ticket, and provide one of multiple nudges those voters will get ahead of Election Day. Party activists Eric Anderson and Ryan Sancardier demonstrated to the rookies how it's done.
Have you thought at all about when you're going to go vote?
I don't know. It's like November, right?
Sure, but a
Election.
lot of your neighbors are early voting.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I
Back
just
near the
talked
old
to
bank
Frank
vault,
down the street.
volunteer
Already
Norm
went to
Draper
voting.
was making his way through a phone call sheet,
How are
getting
you
more
today?
voicemail than live answers.
Good. Say, the reason I called is we've identified you as a probable DFL supporter this November, and we're wondering if we could ask you a few questions.
This is crunch
about,
time, and the all-out
races.
effort to reach and motivate voters is intensifying as Election Day approaches. The parties, candidates, and their allies have it down to a science.
So this slide gives you a visual of what I was talking about with GIS mapping. This is a product called 5 Maps that is provided by a company called Frontline. But what you're seeing on the slide is households, and then you'll see little colored dots on the households. And if you look over on the left, you'll see the what those dots mean. So the top one says voters with estimated VAN scores of 80 or higher. Remember I said VAN is a 1 to 100, the higher the better. And so they've color coded on this map which registered voters live in specific households that have high VAN scores. And then there are other characteristics of voters below that I won't go into, but it's essentially taking your data and putting it in the form of a map. So we've covered door knocking. Back to Gerber and Green. When they talk about phoning, you see again, authentic is bold-faced. If I call you up and say, hi, this is Don Lifto, and you know me, that's going to be a better call than if it's a stranger. Look at the parentheses on those first 2 bullets. If it's an authentic call and you know who's calling you, you get 1 more vote for each 36 calls. If it's a stranger or if it's a professional phone bank and you don't know who they are, you only get 1 for every 106 votes. Calls are more effective the closer they are to Election Day. So I like to see most of the calls done on the Monday or the Tuesday. And here I'm not talking about sorting into yes vote, no, and undecided. I'm talking about calling identified yes voters. You need training, you need scripts, so people aren't winging it. And during the campaign itself, if you collect cell phone numbers, not only can you call them, but you can also text them as part of your get out the vote message. So when you're having those conversations in the driveway or at the front door or at a table at the football game, getting the cell phone numbers can be very, very helpful when you get to the get out the vote process. So the robo auto dialer is again mentioned here. Auto dialer is the systems that school districts have to call, text, email parents automatically. Some lawyers have told school districts it's okay to use that as part of the get out the vote. Others say no. So that's something that you should consult your lawyer with. On the robocalls, the general rule with a robocall is it's got to meet 1 of 2 criteria to be legal in Minnesota. One is it has to be introduced by a live person. So when your phone rings and you pick it up, I say, hi, this is Don Lifto. I'm calling with the Yes for Kids Committee. Please listen to this message. Then you can have a recorded robocall. Oftentimes you try to find that recording to be done by, the mayor of the city or someone who's well-known and well-respected that can have an impact. But the key thing is it's introduced by a live person. And the other way that it can be used is if you've already established a relationship with the person. So back to the canvassing process where we're calling people, door knocking to look for yes voters. If part of that script that I use for that phone call or that knock on the door says, we're going to be doing an automatic phone dialing robocall on election day to remind people to vote, is it okay if we include you on that? If they say yes, then you've established a relationship and you can use that recorded call. Bottom line on that last bullet is if you want to use those systems, double check with your lawyer.
And again, the way that both campaigns understand is the most effective way to persuade those voters in the middle is to reach out to them through their friends and their colleagues and their neighbors.
And that's how the tactics are changing, to try to be particularly influential for those few people who remain undecided. Is that right?
Well, that's right. I think if you back up to take half a step back and ask the question, who do people trust? Do people trust politicians? Not so much. Do people trust the news media? No offense, but not especially.
Right.
Do people trust advertising? Certainly not. They trust each other. They trust their friends. They trust their neighbors. They trust their coworkers.
So again, emphasizing that authentic with phoning as well as with door knocking. It takes more time to plan and more volunteers to make that authentic work. But kind of the bottom line is the more authentic you can be with your contacts, the more successful you will be. Leafleting is when you leave a piece of literature at the front door. So you're not knocking on the door and talking to people. You're just dropping that piece of literature off. For every piece of literature that you drop, you get one more vote in the ballot box for each 189 pieces. It is quicker than door to door. You don't need as many volunteers. If you do decide to leaflet, a door hanger is statistically more effective than a piece of paper on the floor. And a door hanger is something you would put over the doorknob. And the reason that's a little bit more effective is unless people want to leave it on their doorknob, they have to touch it once. And if they get it in their hand once, there's at least a chance they're going to take a look at it. It can include more information about the ballot and what you leave behind at the door. One thing to be cautious about, particularly in a November 2022, is what other things are going to be on the ballot, and where on the ballot is the school district proposal. Sometimes what happens is the school district proposal ends up on the back of the ballot, and people have to, if they don't turn it over, they don't vote. And that's called undervoting. And so you need to know the location of your proposal and whether it's on the front of the ballot or the back, and then help people remember to turn it over if they need to. And this would be an example of a door hanger where if this was the actual door hanger, there'd be a little circle at the top that you would slip over the doorknob. Direct mail is obviously things you put in the mail and send to folks. That does provide an opportunity to differentiate your messages. So maybe with older people 65 and up, part of your message is emphasizing that the initiatives you're going to take and the money you're going to get through this tax increase are going to be used to improve school safety in all of the buildings. And it's also going to be used to improve academic performance in reading and math. Intuitively, you would understand that these were messages that probably would appeal to older adults. For parents of preschool children, they might want to hear about class sizes in kindergarten as a message of importance. In all of your messaging, 4 C's, clear, concise, compelling, and consistent is really, really important. And as is using what sometimes is called barbershop language. Everybody knows what a library is. Everybody does not know what a media center is. So watch your language, clear, concise, compelling, and consistent. Here's an example of something that might be mailed. And you see up on the right, it's telling people where their polling place is. Email, as I mentioned earlier, has no detectable effect. You can improve email by having better subject lines. If you're like me, you typically spend about 10 seconds thinking about what your subject line is going to be. And as you can see in these first 2 or 3 bullets, happening now, cut schools or invest, stand with our schools today. If you are thoughtful and strategic, you can come up with better subject lines, and those subject lines can improve the open rates. Open means that I look at it rather than I just dumping it in the garbage. There also are some suggestions about using something that's a little more compelling than just words in terms of graphics. And the fact that email is no detectable effect doesn't mean you shouldn't use it, but it does mean that you certainly should not rely on it. Here's an example of a subject line that I got. And so when I opened up my email one day, it said flight confirmed. For people who do travel occasionally, an email flight confirmed might be something I want to look at. When I clicked it open, I saw Joe Biden flying in on an airplane. So in this particular case, the purpose of the subject line was one thing only. It was to get me to open it. And once I opened it, then I had a chance to find out what Joe had to say. Texting is 1 out of 312. Again, meaning 1 more vote for each 312 texts. But the good news is there's almost 100% open rate. Most people, if they carry their phones, either they feel a buzz or hear a ding when they get a text. And a lot of us, including me, are just kind of wired that when I feel that buzz or I hear that ding, I reach for my phone, I open it up. So it has a much, much better open rate. Campaign elections said texting is like cutting to the front of the line. That means that it gets people's attention more quickly. And it should be part of every effective get out the vote effort. There are also apps, one of which is called Minivan, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Social media, here you see authentic again. As I said before, while blanket social media might not be that helpful, when you're connected to your friends and sharing information with your friends, it can make a pretty positive impact on getting out the vote, and particularly with Facebook, with 70% of Americans spending an average 71 minutes a day on Facebook. One example of a successful use of social media was in Alexandria. I believe this was when they built their new high school. They designed this logo, and then they asked everybody involved with their campaign to communicate with their social network. And send them this logo. And what they asked people to do when they got it, besides voting, is to go to their Facebook account, for example, or their LinkedIn, and replace their photograph with this logo. And if you're familiar with social media, once hundreds of people had replaced their photograph with this image, all of their friends got notification of a new photograph in their network, and they went to look at the new photograph and got a reminder to vote. Festivals and rallies. This is when you get people together in the auditorium, on the Monday night before the big vote, and you have the band play and you go rah, rah, rah. And as you can see in the top bullet, that can increase turnout up to almost 4%. The fourth bullet down reminds you to make sure when you do your rally that you're not spending public money, or if you are using the gymnasium or the auditorium, that the campaign is paying for using it. You also have to be careful with not violating quid pro quo, buying a vote. An example of that would be, if you vote and bring us I voted sticker, we'll give you a hot dog. That would be quid pro quo. So we want to be careful not to do that.
That's why we're on this tour, to convince the non-voters and the slackers to come out and vote. Who amongst you didn't vote in the 2000 election? Can I see your hands if you did not vote? Don't be afraid. Nothing's going to happen to you. If you did not vote, stand up if you would, please. Stand up back there. Stand up over there. Stand up over here. Anybody? If you did not vote in the 2000 election, 22 or over, I'd like you to pledge in front of all these thousands of people tonight. And if you will do this, my slacker friends, I will give you a full day's supply of the sustenance of slackers everywhere, ramen noodles. Or for you slacker guys, a clean change of underwear.
So an example of a rally. Now, if you think that that's crazy and I could never do something like that, a number of years ago in South St. Paul, they had a rally on the Monday before the big vote in their auditorium, and they had Doug Woog up in front. And any of you that are hockey fans know that he was a very famous and loved coach and hockey player from South St. Paul. So you can do things like this. Remember that making sure you don't use public money in the process. So in terms of our organizing, we need to budget for the cost of GOTV. If we're going to mail out some flyers, they have to be designed and printed and mailed. We need to recruit the volunteers, know the law, use that target structure that we talked about, identifying which of our voters are more likely to vote yes, use multiple GOTV strategies, not just one. And if you only use one, certainly not only email. Differentiate strategies based on past voting history and implement early voting strategies. On the early voting strategies, this year we're looking at, I think, September 23 for the early voting process. And I'll just give you one example of how effective that can be. In North Branch in 2016, they had no organized effort to get early votes in the door. And they had ended up losing a referendum, and they had 122 early votes. 1 year later, they had an organized, concerted effort to get early voters out, and they ended up with 759 early votes. So from 122 to 759, and they won their bond referendum. Early votes can focus on those young voters who don't get in the door very well, and make a big difference. So what's our budget? How much do we need? How many volunteers do we need? What organizations can help? In 2022, because there's a partisan election, you might be able to partner with the Democratic Party, for example, to drop literature off when they're doing their get out the vote work. What are we going to do for phones? Are we going to use cell phones? Are we going to rent phones? Do we need cars to give people rides who can't get to the polls? Where's our coordination going to take place in terms of, particularly on the Monday and Tuesday, who's in charge, who's monitoring the get out the vote effort, how are we communicating, and what is that staging site? This graph I'll go through quickly, but it basically reinforces the idea that one size does not fit all. So over on the left, you're seeing voters who, based on our database, have voted in at least 6 out of the last 9 referenda where they had a chance to vote. 6 out of 9, that's really good. And so over on the right, what you're seeing is the only intervention they're going to get is a phone call to remind them to vote. Now, you still need to call them. Remember that chart I showed you that the assumed yes voters who were not contacted had a horrible turnout? You still need to contact them, but you don't have to invest a lot of time and resources to get them in the door. Compare that to the bottom with an identified yes voter. So they told somebody they're going to vote yes, but they've only voted in either 0 out of 9 or 1 out of 9. In that case, you need 9 to 11 interventions to get them in the door, according to research. And you can see those listed. Now, you don't have the time, resources, and volunteers to make that massive an effort with everybody. So what you're doing is identifying specific groups, and those who only need a phone call only get a phone call. Those who need 9 to 11 interventions are going to get them. And this is a profile of a successful get out the vote. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I'll just show you the top 2 parts of these bar graphs. Over on the left in that light green all the way to the top, that's showing you how many people in the full profile had VAN scores of 80 or higher. Remember, the higher the VAN score, the better. So on the left, the light green is how many or what proportion of all voters had those high VAN scores. Over on the right, what you're seeing is what portion of the ballots in the ballot box came from people with high VAN scores. And you can see that green area on the right is much, much larger. And that's what you're trying to accomplish. You're trying to get people who are identified as yes voters in the door in larger proportions than people who are not likely to vote yes. In terms of summary and recommendations, developed a detailed GOTV plan. Everything I've gone through today, you need to develop a local plan for how you're going to approach GOTV. Identify your target, which is 130% of what you need to win. Develop your target structure. Maybe your number 1 target is people with VAN scores of over 80. Maybe your number 2 target is parents who have VAN scores over 50. Your number 3 target might be preschool parents. So develop your target. Go and find your yes voters. That's the canvassing stage of the campaign. Call, knock on doors, drive people to websites, have tables at the football game. Find the number of yes voters you need to win. And remember, shoe leather politics, the gold standard, personal contact, authentic, even better. Door to door is the best way to be successful with GOTV. And when it's actually time to do your reminder calls, if I've got if I voted in 6 out of the last 9 elections, all I need is a call. But if my son, who is identified yes voter, has voted in 1 out of 9, he needs many, many more interventions to get that ballot in the ballot box. Authentic. It works much better. And so incorporate that into your planning. Engage young voters. One way to kind of measure whether you're doing that, for those of you who are doing a November 2022, have you had young voters at the table now in terms of planning and preparing for the election? Festivals and rallies can be used to fire up people. Don't necessarily give away Roman noodles and underwear, but festivals can fire people up. And as we talked about with New Prague, or Belplain, you never know whether one more vote is going to make a difference. And if those of you who are in track when you're in high school or college, most track coaches tell you that you have to run through the finish line, not to the finish line. Run through the finish line with that GOTV effort. I'm going to finish with a short video clip that reinforces that. And then as soon as that's over, for those of you who would like to stay on the call with questions, you can unmute yourself and ask any questions that you might have. Thank you.
오빤 강남 스타일 강남 스타일 낮에는 따사로운 인간적인 여자 커피 한 잔에 여유를 아는 품격 있는 여자 밤이 오면 심장이 뜨거워지는 여자 그런 반전 있는 여자 너는 선어해 낮에는 너만큼 따사로운 그런 선어해 커피 식기도 전에 원샷 때리는 선어해 밤이 오면 심장이 터져버리는 선어해 그런 선어해 아름다워 사랑스러워 그래 너 그래 바로 너 아름다워 사랑스러워 그래 너 그래 바로 너 지금부터 갈 때까지 가볼까 오빤 강남 스타일
I won't show the whole thing. It's very entertaining. That was from the Houston, Texas Public Schools and part of their Get Out the Vote campaign. A couple quick comments about resources. The book that I recently published with Barb Nickel does have a full chapter on GOTV planning, if that's of interest to you. Green and Gerber are the researchers I talked about. Politics the Wellstone Way also has a good section in that book on GOTV. I talked several times about the VAN scores. If you are interested in getting access to that or learning more about that, you can work with your local Education Minnesota president and get in contact with Jim Meyer at Ed Minnesota and find out about how you can use VAN data for your referendum. And for those scripts, you need a phone script, you need a door knocking script. There's a link there that you can go to and get some free examples of scripts. And if you're interested in the GIS mapping, Carrie Charbonneau from Frontline would be the person to talk to. One last comment for me, and then I'll stay on the line for anyone who has questions that you want to raise. And that is that MASA will provide a PDF of my presentation today. So if that's of interest to you, you can, is that going to be automatic, Dave, or do they need to email?
We'll send it out with the link to the video.
Okay. It'll come out with a link. So you can look forward to having that if that's helpful as well. And I'll stop there. And anyone who has a question, feel free to unmute. And for the rest of you, thanks for attending.